One does not sell a country by putting up a sign saying, "For sale." That would be too obvious. One does it more politely. One calls it an investment, or a partnership, or, the favorite of mine, a regeneration. One calls it unlocking growth. And to be fair, sometimes that is exactly what people are trying to do. A town needs a bridge, a hospital needs replacing, a school is falling apart, a water network is tired, a railway station no longer works for the number of people using it. And to be fair, I spoke with many rail engineers and they don't use rail travel. I don't know why. Well, I do, but I'm not gonna share it here with you. Not right now. So capital arrives. A project is announced. People gather around the model. The renders look good. The press release says all the right things and everyone claps. And why wouldn't they? Something is finally happening. That's the part we have to be honest about. This is not an episode about pretending infrastructure does not need money. It does, a lot of it. It always has. Someone always pays. The question is not whether money should enter the system. You cannot run the system without money. The question is what the system becomes when public infrastructure is treated less like a long-term public asset and more like a long-term financial product. That is where things start to change and unravel. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly. Through contracts, through concessions, through index payments, through regulated returns, through service charges, and through long-term claims on future income. And after a while, the thing being built is not just the bridge or a hospital or the road or tunnel. The thing being built is the payment stream around it. People make projects that bring profits, but profits decide which projects get built and what people become. This is Bytnar Talks. People, projects, profits. Hi, and welcome to Bytnar Talks. I'm Piotr Bytnar, founder of Bytnar Limited, a chartered structural engineering practice founded in 2017. At Bytnar, we work around the point where design, delivery, commercial pressure, and organizational capabilities all start meeting each other. And that is usually where projects become interesting, because a project is never just a technical exercise. It is never just drawings, calculations, schedules, and specifications. Those things do matter, of course. They matter a lot. But every project also carries assumptions. Financial assumptions, political ones, operational assumptions, and human assumptions. Assumptions about who will carry the risk, who will make decisions, who will maintain the assets, who will pay for it later, and who will still understand the thing once the people who set it up have moved on. And once those assumptions become contracts, buildings, roads, utilities, and long-term payments, they become very difficult to unwind. This is what this episode is about. Rent. Not rent in the simple sense of paying for a flat. Economic rent. The money earned not by creating new value directly, but by controlling access to something people need. Things like a bridge, or a network, a piece of land, a regulated asset, a route, a service, a position in the system that others have to pass through. And once you start seeing infrastructure that way, some familiar things begin to look slightly different. Not because they are automatically wrong, not because everyone involved is somehow cynical, but because the incentives around them change. The asset still looks like infrastructure, concrete, steel pipes, roads, buildings, but around it sits another structure, a financial structure. And sometimes that financial structure becomes more protected than the physical one. That is the tension I want to sit with you today. Sit with us in this episode. This episode is called The Rent Nation. How to sell a country to the sound of clapping. Let's get into it. A simple way to think about rent is to imagine a village with one well. Someone digs it, that takes effort, it takes risk, and it takes skill. The village now has water and life improves. That feels like value creation, doesn't it? There is work, there is usefulness, and there is a return connected to that usefulness. Now imagine a different scenario, that years later someone buys the land around the well. They do not deepen it or make it better, they do not improve the water, they do not increase supply, but they now control the route to it. So every bucket has a fee attached. The well still works, the water still flows, the village still needs it, but the income now comes from controlling the access. That is rent. And that difference matters. Profit usually needs production. Rent needs position. Profit depends on creating something valuable. Rent depends on controlling something people cannot easily avoid. Now, in the real world, those two things often overlap. Infrastructure can create value and produce rent at the same time. A bridge can genuinely help a place function better, while also becoming a long-term revenue stream. So this is not a neat moral story. It is not profit good, rent bad sort of scenario. It is more subtle than that. The problem starts with the system, where the system becomes better at protecting the rent than improving the value. That is when things begin to tilt, because people adapt to what the system rewards. If the system rewards better assets, you get focus on better assets, don't you? But if it rewards long-term claims on assets, you get focus on structuring those claims. And over time, a lot of intelligence moves in that direction. People become very good at making payments predictable. They become good at reducing investor risk. They become good at designing contracts that hold for decades. They become good at turning public need into stable yield. None of this has to be secret. None of it has to be illegal. In fact, most of it can be very professionally done. That is why it is powerful. The country is not sold in some dramatic moment. It is sold in a meeting where everyone is being reasonable. A public body needs an asset. Capital wants a stable return. Advisors build the structure. The project becomes bankable, and everyone can explain their part perfectly well. That is usually how these things happen. Not through one bad decision, through a chain of reasonable decisions that slowly change the character of the system. And that is where we have to be careful, because once infrastructure becomes primarily attractive as a yield product, the project is no longer judged only by whether it works well. It is also judged by whether the income around it is predictable. That changes design, it changes procurement, it changes risk allocation, and it changes who has confidence in the room. And it changes what people are allowed to question later. At Bytnar, this is where we tend to pay attention quite closely to, because delivery problems often begin much earlier than delivery. By the time something reaches the project team, the pressure may already be built into the structure. And the contractor is not just building a wall. And the engineer is not just solving a detail. And the client is not just asking for progress. Everyone is operating inside a financial and contractual environment that has already decided what must be protected. And its margin. And very often, what must be protected first, after the margin, is a payment stream. The asset matters. But the payment stream matters in a different way. It has funders behind it, contracts behind it, models behind it, expectations behind it. And once that structure exists, the project has to live inside it. That is where things get interesting, because the asset is physical, but the pressure is financial, and pressure always shows up somewhere. Infrastructure is attractive to capital for a very simple reason. People keep needing it. We can choose not to buy plenty of things, can't we? We can cancel subscriptions, delay purchases, cut back on luxury goods, or that Starbucks vanilla latte. But we cannot really opt out of water, electricity, housing, transport, school, hospitals, or access to work. The systems sit underneath everyday life. That makes them incredibly important socially. It also makes them incredibly attractive financially. If you are managing pension money, insurance money, sovereign wealth money, or infrastructure fund money, you are not always looking for excitement. In fact, you're not. You're looking for stable returns. You're looking for something that lasts. You want income that is steady. You want contracts that are enforceable. You want demand that does not disappear overnight. Infrastructure can offer that. And again, there is nothing automatically wrong with that. A pension fund investing in infrastructure is not some villain in a cartoon. It is trying to produce stable returns for people who will need pensions later. That is real. But the logic of pension capital is not the same as the logic of public service. They may overlap, but they are not identical. A bridge to the public is a way of crossing a river. To an investor, it may be a long-duration cash flow. To a contractor, it is a delivery risk. To a local authority, it is the public responsibility. To the user, it is part of daily life. Same bridge, different realities. And when pressure appears, and it does, those realities do not always stay aligned. This is one of the things we see again and again around projects. People can be talking about the same asset while defending different versions of value. The fund wants predictability. The operator wants manageable obligations. The contractor wants risk priced properly. The client wants delivery. The public wants the thing to work. The technical team wants the asset to be safe, durable, and buildable. Nobody has to be acting badly for conflict to appear. The system itself creates the tension. And if the project does not have enough capability to hold those perspectives together, things start to drift. That is why capability matters so much, not just capacity, not just more people, more meetings, more reports. Capability, the ability to understand complexity under pressure, the ability to see how finance, delivery, and technical reality are affecting each other, the ability to ask early enough, what is this project really becoming? Because sometimes, by the time the asset is announced publicly, the most important decisions have already been made. Not visibly, structurally. The concession length, the payment model, the risk transfer, the indexation, the future maintenance obligations, the rights to refinance. The things that sound boring at the beginning often become the things that matter most later. Nobody claps for those details, but those details decide who has room to move in 20 years. Long contracts are powerful. We often treat them like administration, a 30-year agreement, a 40-year concession, a long-term maintenance contract, an index service payment. It sounds dry, almost neutral. But a long contract is not neutral. It reaches into the future and decides what the future will owe. That is why investors like it. It creates stability. It makes income easier to model. It reduces uncertainty. It turns an asset into something that can be valued, financed, traded, and held inside a portfolio. But the same thing that creates stability for capital can create rigidity for the system. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because at the start, rigidity can feel like certainty. Everyone wants certainty at the start. But clients want to know the cost. Funders want to know the revenue. Contractors want to know the risk. Politicians want to know when they can announce completion. The whole system is hungry for certainty. But projects do not stay still. conditions change, inflation changes, technology changes, maintenance realities change, public expectation change, climate risk evolves, usage changes. The world around the contract moves. The contract may not. And if the contract is too tightly protected, the asset can become difficult to adapt even when the adaptation is the sensible thing to do. You see, this is the language. Early in a project, people speak quite openly. They talk about options, what might work, what they explore. Then once the commercial structure tightens, the language changes. Suddenly, everything is scope, change, entitlement, approval, liability, risk profile. None of those words are wrong. They are part of serious project delivery. But they do tell you something. They tell you the project has moved from finding the best answer to protecting the answer already agreed. And sometimes that is necessary. A project cannot be endlessly fluid. But there is a point where the structure starts defending itself more than the outcome. That is where organizations need judgment. And judgment is not something you can outsource completely. This is one of those things I keep coming back to at Bytnar. You can outsource design packages, and we do this. You can outsource delivery, we can help with this. You can outsource maintenance, we often are the part of the whole picture. And you can outsource advice. That's what people come to us for. But you cannot fully outsource understanding. And we got that, but many people around us don't. So you cannot do it, not really safely. Because if the client no longer understands the asset, the risks, the interfaces, the condition, the assumptions, and the long-term obligations, then the client is not really in control. It may hold the contract, but the real power sits elsewhere. That is one of the quiet ways a country sells itself. Not by openly handing over everything, but by losing the capability to understand what it has committed to. And once that happens, future flexibility becomes expensive. There is another part of this which I think people understand instinctively when you explain it simply. Well, the second harvest, I'd say. During construction, infrastructure is risky. Ground condition may surprise you, design assumptions may change, costs may move, interfaces can be messy. Programs slip, things go wrong, so capital price is that risk. Fair enough. But once the asset is built and operating, the risk usually changes. Revenue becomes more predictable, the asset has a track record, the uncertainty reduces, and at that point, refinancing becomes possible. Cheaper debt can replace more expensive debt. The equity value can rise. The structure can be optimized. The return improves, but the asset itself may not have improved at all. The road did not get smoother because the debt changed. The school did not gain another classroom. The hospital did not treat more patients because the capital stack was adjusted. The improvement happened in the financial structure. That is not automatically wrong, but it tells you where some of the intelligence in the system is focused. It is not always focused on making the physical asset better. Sometimes it is focused on making the financial claim around the asset more profitable. That distinctions matter. Because if infrastructure behaves like a financial product, people will optimize it like one. They will look for value in refinancing, in risk repricing, in contract interpretation, in regulatory settlements, in exit values, in yield compression. And they may be very good at it, often much better resourced than the public body on the other side. That imbalance matters. Because one side may be managing the asset as part of a portfolio, the other side may be trying to keep a public service running. Same asset, different game. And if the public side does not have enough retained capability, it can become dependent on the very structure it is supposed to manage. That is not a technicality. That is the heart of the issue. The stronger the financial structure, the stronger the client capability needs to be. Otherwise, the system becomes easy to finance and difficult to govern. And that is not a small problem, because infrastructure is not a short-term product. It sits in people's lives for decades. The toll is probably the easiest way to feel this, isn't it? A bridge is built, it costs a lot of money, right? A toll is introduced as it happens. At first people understand it. The bridge had to be paid for. Maintenance costs money. The user benefits, so the user contributes. It may not be perfect, but it makes sense. Then years pass. The bridge becomes part of ordinary life. People build routines around it. Businesses depend on it. The original justification becomes less visible, but the toll remains. Maybe it rises, maybe the reason changes, maybe now it is about maintenance, then life cycle renewal, then contract obligations, then investor return. Eventually people stop asking what the toll was originally for. They just live around it. That is when rent becomes normal, and normal is powerful. A payment that would feel outrageous if introduced overnight can become invisible if it grows slowly enough. A few percent here, a small charge there, an annual increase, a service fee, a standing charge, a management cost, a regulated return hidden inside a bill. One by one, they do not feel like the whole story. Together, they change the country. They make ordinary life more expensive, not always dramatically, just persistently. Less room is in household budgets, less margin in businesses, less flexibility for public bodies, less space in project budgets, and eventually, less patience. That is usually when people begin asking very simple questions. Why are we still paying? Why is the bill rising when the service feels the same? Why is the return protected by performance seems ordinary? Why does everything now come with a charge attached? Those questions may not use technical language, but they are legitimacy questions. And legitimacy is crucial. A contract can secure payment, a regulator can define returns, a concession can allocate risk, but no financial structure is completely separate from public tolerance. People will accept rent while it feels proportionate to value. When it stops feeling proportionate, the mood changes. What is when rent becomes visible? And once rent becomes visible, it becomes political. Not necessarily party political, political in the deeper sense. People start asking who the system is serving, like we got with our rail or waterworks system. That matters to investors too, because when political risk rises, capital asks for more protection. More protection often means higher cost. Higher cost increases pressure on users. That makes the rent even more visible. And the loop tightens. This is the trap. Rent needs stability, but too much rent can damage the legitimacy that created the stability in the first place. This is why I do not think the useful conversation is public good, private bad. That is too simplistic. Public bodies can be slow, under-resourced, and fragmented. Private capital can bring discipline, expertise, and delivery momentum. Public procurement can waste money. Private finance can be expensive. Public ownership can neglect maintenance. Private ownership can extract too much. The real world does not fit clean slogans. The useful question is system design. What is the asset supposed to do? Who is best placed to manage which risk? What return is fair for that risk? What capability must remain with the client? How will performance be checked? What happens if the assumptions fail? Who benefits from refinancing? Who pays if maintenance is deferred? And maybe, most importantly, who still understands the asset 20 years later? Those questions are not glamorous. They do not make good ribbon-cutting speeches. but they are often where the real value sits, in the boring competence, in the retained knowledge, in the ability to challenge assumptions, in the ability to read the asset, not just the contract. This is where Bytnar lens naturally sits. We care about the technical work, of course we do, but technical work does not exist in a vacuum. A structure can be designed correctly and still sit inside a poor delivery system. A project can comply with the contract and still leave behind a fragile asset. A building can be handed over and still create long-term dependency. So the question is not only can we build it, the better question is, can the system own what it has built? That is a much higher test, and I think it is one we do not always take seriously enough. Because we have become very good at creating structures. Financial structures, procurement structures, governance structures, advisory structures, commercial structures, but not always as good at retaining the practical capability needed to live with those structures. And if the capability thins out too far, the organization starts relying on the contract to do the thinking. I'll let you on a secret. Contracts do not think. People do, or at least they should. There is also a cultural effect. Once infrastructure becomes a yield product, the language around it changes. People talk more about bankability, investment confidence, risk appetite, revenue certainty, portfolio value, and long-term returns. You know, those little chit-chats by the bar in the City of London. Those words are not wrong. They are useful in the right place, but they pull attention in a particular direction. They make capital confidence the center of gravity. And when that happens, everything else begins to orbit around it. Design becomes something that must not disturb the model. Procurement becomes something that must reassure the market. Delivery becomes something that must absorb certainty. Maintenance becomes a cost within a return structure. Public accountability becomes harder to trace because responsibility sits across funders, operators, subcontractors, regulators, and advisors. And meetings become more careful. You can feel it. People do not always say what they see. They translate it. A technical issue becomes a commercial exposure, a maintenance concern becomes a compliance matter, an operational difficulty becomes a reporting line, a disagreement becomes a contractual position. The meeting may still look calm, but it narrows. And when meetings narrow, learning becomes harder. That matters because infrastructure needs learning. It needs honest feedback. It needs people able to say early, this is not working as intended. But if saying that threatens the financial structure, people become cautious. Not necessarily dishonest, just cautious. And cautious systems learn late. That is a problem. Because infrastructure cannot afford to learn late. The consequences are too long. At Bytnar, this is why we do not treat coordination as admin. Coordination is not just putting meetings in diaries. It is the ability of a project environment to keep reality visible across parties with different incentives. That is difficult enough on ordinary projects. It becomes harder when the financial structure around the asset is powerful. Because each party sees something slightly different. The investor sees a yield profile, the contractor sees risk, the operator sees service obligations, the public sees experience, the designer sees technical constraints, the client sees responsibility, and somewhere in the middle, the asset has to actually work. That is where projects reveal organizational maturity. They show whether a system can hold different perspectives together, or whether everyone slowly retreats into protecting their own position. Now, the phrase "to the sound of clapping" matters, because applause is part of the mechanism. I do not mean literal applause only. I mean approval, relief, confidence, momentum, the feeling that something is finally moving. A town gets investment, yay! A tired asset gets replaced, woohoo! The project that has been stuck gets unlocked, what a relief. A politician gets to announce progress, good PR. A fund gets a stable asset. The professional team gets a scheme to work on, the community sees cranes and activity, there is a genuine emotional pull in that. Especially in a country where so much infrastructure feels tired. When people have waited long enough, almost any investment can feel like rescue. And rescue does not always get negotiated as hard as ordinary investment. That is the vulnerability. Pressure narrows the time horizon. It happens on projects all the time. A client under pressure accepts a structure they would have challenged earlier. A contractor accepts risk because the pipeline is thin. A consultant accepts a scope that is too tight because the work needs to be won. A public body accepts complexity because the alternative is no project. Nobody has to be foolish here. They are responding to pressure, but rent grows in exactly the same space, between short-term urgency and long-term obligation. That is one of the central patterns here. Short-term urgency, long-term obligation. That's the biggest leverage we see. Repeat that across housing, water, energy, transport, health, education and public estates, and you do not get one dramatic sale. You get a rent nation, a place where more and more of the future is already spoken for. Not always badly, but heavily. And heaviness matters. Future payments reduce future choices. Every long contract takes up space. Every index obligation makes tomorrow a little less flexible. Every guaranteed revenue stream gives certainty to one side and commitment to another. On its own, that may be manageable. Across the whole system, it changes the feel of the economy. The system tightens slowly, bills rise slowly, charges become normal, public flexibility reduces quietly. And then one day people ask why everything feels so blimey expensive. But it did not happen in one day. It accumulated. For contractors and delivery teams, this is not abstract. It lands in real places, in procurement, in risk allocation, in design responsibility, in payment terms, in margin pressure, in buildability compromises, in late information, in value engineering that is not really value engineering, but budget repair. The financial structure might sit far upstream, but the pressure travels. Eventually, it reaches the people expected to make the asset real, and very often, they are dealing with consequences created much earlier. You see that pattern. The scheme begins with ambition, then affordability tightens, then scope reduces, then risks move down the chain, then coordination becomes strained, then everyone is surprised that quality, time and relationships are under pressure. But the pressure did not start on site. It arrived there. That is worth saying plainly. A lot of delivery problems are not created by delivery teams. They are inherited by them. That does not remove responsibility from the people delivering the work, but it does mean we need to understand where the pressure comes from. If upstream yield is protected and downstream affordability is squeezed, something has to absorb the difference. Often it is the supply chain. Sometimes it is quietly, sometimes it is time, quality, sometimes it is time, sometimes it is trust. Usually it is a bit of everything. Quality, time and trust go first. This is why Bytnar keeps coming back to visibility. Who is carrying the risk? Who understands the assumptions? Where has pressure moved? What has become invisible? Where is the project relying on goodwill instead of capability? Those questions matter. Because when people are blamed for symptoms without understanding the structure that produced them, the same problems reappear. And that is how systems become expensive. Not just because materials cost more, not just because labor costs more, but because the system keeps creating pressure and then paying different people to manage the consequences. That is not productivity at all. That is circulation. Money moving around a system that is not learning properly. Housing makes this very easy to feel. A home can be shelter, it can be stability, it can be where a family family builds a life, but the home can also be a yield product, a rent roll, a leveraged asset, a planning gain opportunity, a store of wealth, a financial instrument with bedrooms. And once housing is treated too strongly through that second lens, people feel it. They may not describe it as financialization. They may simply say, "This place does not feel like it was built for us." That sentence matters, because people can feel the intention of a place. They feel it in the layout, in the service charge, in the public space that looks good in the render, but feels thin in use. In the lack of local infrastructure, in the difference between marketing language and daily reality. A place shaped mainly by extraction has a different texture. It may still be new, it may still be expensive, it may even look impressive. But something about it feels narrow. That is what incentives do. They become physical. They show up in walls, routes, materials, maintenance, access, management, and the small frictions of daily life. Projects reveal that the system actually values, not what it says it values. What survives the process, what gets funded, what gets protected, what gets cut, what gets handed over, and what people live with after the applause. So what happens when rent grows faster than value? That is the big question, isn't it? Rent can be tolerated when people feel the value. If the train walks, the fare feels different. If the water is reliable, the bill feels different. If the home is well built and maintained, the rent feels different. If the public service genuinely improves, the long-term payment feels different. People understand that things cost money. What they struggle with is paying more while feeling less. Higher bills, ordinary service. Higher charges, less reliability. Higher rents, less security. Higher public commitments, less control. That is when legitimacy starts to narrow, not collapse, narrow. The mood slowly changes in the society. Regulators become sharper, politicians become less patient, the press starts paying attention. Investors start talking about political risk. And once political risk rises, capital asks for more return. That higher return increases the cost. The higher cost increases public pressure. Public pressure makes the rent more visible, and the loop tightens. That is why excessive rent is dangerous even for investors, because stable yield depends on social permission, and social permission depends on people feeling that the arrangement is broadly fair. Not perfect, fair enough. Once that feeling goes, the contract may still exist, but the atmosphere around it changes. Anyone who has worked on difficult projects knows how important atmosphere is. Formal structures can look intact long after confidence has moved. The report can still say green. The meeting can still sound controlled, but people know. They feel the shift before it appears in the numbers. The same is true of infrastructure systems. Rent becomes risky when it stops feeling connected to value. That is the moment the system starts consuming the trust it depends on. So where does that leave us? I do not think it leaves us with a neat answer, but it does leave us with better questions. Before we celebrate investment, we should ask what kind of claims it creates. Before we sign long contracts, we should ask what flexibility we are giving away. Before we transfer risk, we should ask whether the risk has already moved or just changed name. Before we outsource delivery, we should ask what understanding must remain with the client. Before we accept stable yield, we should ask what level of performance justifies it. And before we clap, we should ask what happens after the photographs. That is not cynicism, that is stewardship. And stewardship is probably the word that sits underneath this whole episode. Because infrastructure is not just an asset class. It is the physical operating system of society. If it fails, people feel it. If it becomes too expensive, people feel it. If it becomes too rigid, organizations feel it. If it becomes too financialized, delivery feels it. And if nobody retains the capability to understand it properly, the whole system becomes easier to sell than to govern. Easier to sell than to govern. That is the line. Selling is immediate, governance is long. Selling has a transaction, governance has responsibility. Selling has announcements, governance has maintenance, condition surveys, technical competence, contract monitoring, awkward questions, and institutional memory. Selling is visible, stewardship often is not. But stewardship is where value is protected. And that is why Bytnar's work keeps coming back to capability. Not more noise, not more paperwork, not more process for the sake of the process. Capability. The ability to understand complexity without freezing. The ability to coordinate across incentives. The ability to see pressure early. The ability to hold technical and commercial reality in the same conversation. And the ability to ask not only, is this project progressing, but what is this project becoming? Because those are very different questions. A project can progress while dependency grows. Investment can arrive while flexibility leaves. An asset can be built while the future is quietly committed. A country can look like it is developing while more and more of its future usefulness is being monetized. That is the bottom of it. And it is worth seeing clearly. A country can look like it is developing while more and more of its future usefulness is being monetized. So maybe this is the simplest way to say it. A country is not only sold when ownership changes hands, it is sold when ordinary access becomes a chain of long-term claims. It is sold when public need becomes predictable yield without enough public capability on the other side. It is sold when the people delivering value are squeezed harder than the people controlling access. It is sold when the payment lasts longer than the reason people accept it in the first place. And it is sold most easily when everyone is relieved enough to clap. But investment is not the enemy. Poorly understood dependency is infrastructure needs capital, but it also needs proportion. It needs competence on both sides. It needs contracts that protect value, not only payment. It needs public bodies that understand what they are buying. It needs private capital that understands legitimacy is part of the asset. It needs project teams able to say what is really before reality becomes expensive. And it needs us to stop confusing money arriving with value being created. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. And the future of infrastructure probably depends on whether we can tell the difference early enough. At Bytnar, this is why we look beneath the visible project. The building, the bridge, the road, the pipe, the program, that is where the system becomes physical. But the forces shaping it often sit upstream. In incentives, in finance, in contracts, in risk, in capability, in what people are allowed to challenge, and in what the system rewards. Once you see that, you stop asking only, what are we building? You start asking, what are we committing ourselves to? And maybe that is the real question behind this episode. Who will still be paying for this when the clapping has stopped? Because the clapping always stops. The payment does not always stop with it. And that is where the real test begins. Thanks for spending a bit of time with me on this one. It is not the simplest thing to untangle, but it sits underneath more projects, more builds, more contracts, and more delivery pressure than we probably admit. The most visible one at this moment is housing and its credit-driven asset inflation that prohibits common folk from ever owning their own place on earth. Sounds familiar? When? When you are between 20 and 40 years old. In UK, it probably does. So if this gave you a slightly different lens on infrastructure, investment contracts or what we call progress, then it has done its job. There is no neat ending to this one, really. Just the reality of how these things tend to play out. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Remember, it's all up to you, so design the world around you.